This is the camera that changed how I see the streets, and I sold it. It gave me an obsession with the 28mm focal length. I bought the Fuji X100V in June of 2023, right at the peak of the hype. And honestly, I hated it. I was using it like my other cameras and it just didn't work. But once I found its real purpose and its place in my street kit, everything changed. It kickstarted a whole new chapter of how I shoot, and I came to love it. And then, I let it go. Here's why I sold the best camera I ever owned for street photography. I just quickly want to introduce myself. My name is Embreen, aka Hipster in Copenhagen. I'm a self-taught street photographer, and I've been doing street photography for over a decade. Check out my website where you can sign up for my newsletter or read my free street photography blog. I also have street photography courses and other resources for you to explore. Alright, let's get back to the video. I bought my Fuji X100V back in the summer of 2023, and to be completely honest, I fell for the hype. That was at an all-time high back then. And before that, I didn't know much about the Fujifilm brand as a whole, except they made these really cool retro-looking cameras. But I convinced myself that the Fuji X100V would definitely add its magic to my street photography. So I bought the Fuji X100V partly because I was curious and partly because of FOMO, so fear of missing out. But aside from that, my main driver was that I was in the market looking for a pocket-sized camera. So I was looking at the Ricoh GR series. And the Fuji just came along because of the hype, I think. I got really interested in that because back then I was shooting with my Sony A7C, a full-frame camera. I was very much into night street photography. I had a lot of fast prime lenses and I was doing those high contrast silhouette photographs, you know, those really tack sharp photographs. So I wanted to challenge myself to see differently and do a different type of street photography, and also maybe during the day. So I wanted those close, gritty, personal photographs, and that requires me to be more stealthy. Back then, I didn't feel like the Sony A7C with its prime lenses were a small, compact camera. So that was actually one of the reasons that I wanted to pivot my street photography. And after some serious effort, I actually managed to secure a brand new Fuji X100V in black. But once I had it in my hand, I would say the magic, I really didn't feel it right away. After getting the Fuji X100V for the first few weeks and trying it out for street photography, I would say my initial impression of the camera was a disappointment. It was a very underwhelming experience for me, and I also talk about it in one of my other videos. You can find that on the channel. And I think there were a few factors that contributed for me to have that experience, because as a new user to Fujifilm, I've never owned a Fujifilm camera before. I had to get used to the whole layout, the buttons, the menu. And to build up that muscle memory, it took some time. And one of the things I think I mentioned in my previous video was that it had so many buttons that I could customize whichever way I wanted to. And of course, many would say that's a pro, because often people say we don't have enough customization we can do on our cameras. But back then, as a newbie Fujifilm shooter, that was too overwhelming for me. So it took me a minute to get to learn and get a handle on the camera. The first thing I noticed was that the autofocus was really slow. It couldn't always grab on to people, especially if they were moving a little bit faster than normal pace. And also the camera was in general just slow, especially if you put on those film simulations. And often I did that because that was also one of the reasons I bought the camera. It felt like it took almost half a second from I pressed the shutter and until it was stored and the camera was ready. Half a second-ish is a long time to wait, especially if you want to take multiple photographs. And yeah, so initially, the experience was not what I expected. So looking back now and also reflecting back at the time, I remember that I think one of the main issues was that I tried to really use the Fuji X100V as my Sony A7C, which is a full frame camera. I can change lenses on it. And so basically I tried to treat it or use it as a pocket-sized A7C. Of course, you cannot compare two different systems. That's why probably some of the initial impressions were not very good. And that's when I realized that I needed to figure out how to use the X100V for my street photography and what kind of gap it would fill. The real breakthrough came when I finally figured out the true purpose of the Fuji X100V when doing street photography, but also its place in my street kit. And that really ties into the challenge I gave myself back in 2023. So I wanted to get closer to my subjects. I wanted to make different type of photographs, so really change my shooting style, going from night to day and so forth. And having that in the back of my mind really helped me to put aside all my negative impressions of the camera that I've had so far and really give it a fair shot. Really try to, from a clean slate, say, okay, how can I use this camera? For what purpose? And really not try to compare to other types of street photography that I was doing with other cameras that I had at the time. So I just started slowly with like no plan, no pressure. I just went out almost every day with the camera in hand. So slowly getting used to the camera and just try to use it as much as possible. Along the way, I think it took maybe a month or a little bit more than a month that I really started to enjoy using my Fuji X100V. I was slowly getting used to and building up my muscle memory. I also started to be more bold out on the streets. I was getting closer to people because it had a 35mm equivalent, and is that you have to stand a little bit closer to people. And that led me to buy the 28mm focal length, but that's a whole different discussion. So yeah, over time, it just became so much fun. And along the way, it also became my EDC camera because of its compact size. So in a very short amount of time, I went from not really liking the camera, having a very bad impression of the camera, to really loving it and really enjoying street photography as a whole. After 6 months of use, I would say the Fuji X100V had definitely become my daily driver. So my main EDC, so everyday carry camera. And I had a purpose for that camera because I knew exactly what I could use that camera for when doing street photography. So let me just put some words on that. So I primarily used it for day street photography, and I mostly did candid street photography or classic street photography. So where you're out there on the streets trying to capture your subjects, maybe at a closer distance. That also led me to experiment with different focal lengths. So the Fuji X100V had a 35mm equivalent, and the 35mm and we're not friends. And we have never been friends, and I would say I always called the 35mm my nemesis focal length. But that led me to really down the path of experimenting with the 28mm because I bought the conversion lens and I just loved the 28. And if you've been a long-time follower, you know about my 28mm obsession. But anyway, moving on from that, I would say I also shifted my shooting style, as I mentioned before. So I was actually making those photographs that I gave myself as a challenge. And it took some time because you need to have a little bit of more confidence. So I was slowly starting to build confidence because my camera was so compact, I could hide it and be more stealthy. And yes, I do get nervous still to this day, even though I've been doing street photography for 10 years, when I'm taking pictures of subjects that are really close. So I try to be really fast about it. The settings I had on that camera, they were more or less set. I never changed them, except I was doing something completely different for its real purpose that I was using it for. I had the aperture set at f8, so I had deep depth of field contra shallow depth of field with my nice street photography work and the fast prime lenses. My ISO was roughly around 500, but it was more or less a range, so it could go up and down depending on the light conditions. And the shutter speed was around 1/500 of a second, and I would change it if I needed to. Mostly I wouldn't because of the pace that I walk and the pictures that I'm trying to make. 1/500 is more than enough to capture and freeze motion. Every time I picked up my camera, the Fuji X100V, I knew exactly the settings. I hardly changed it, and I knew exactly what I was getting when using that camera. So one of the great things that I came to appreciate was that I didn't have to make so many decisions when picking up the Fuji X100V. You know, it was a fixed lens camera. I couldn't really change it except putting on a conversion lens. So it was a little bit set in that way, whereas with my Sony, I had like a variety of lenses I could choose, or I could bring with me. Here, I just had my camera on my shoulder and I just went out. And ultimately, what really won me over with that camera was that I started to grow as a street photographer. I really started to enjoy street photography, all because of that little camera and what I could do with it. Exactly a year after I bought my Fuji X100V, I bought the Leica M6, a fully mechanical camera, a film camera. And that's where another shift started to happen when it came to street photography for me. So let me explain it this way. I started to notice that I was more or less in two minds when it came to do street photography. So film and digital, they complement each other so well, in my opinion. And for me, the issue was that they started to compete for my attention. So every time I went out, I had to ask myself, do I shoot digital or do I shoot film today? And on some days, sure, it was a very easy decision. I could just pick up my camera because it was overcast or it was raining. Or maybe I was just in the mood to do film street photography. But on those days that I didn't know, that indecision really actually started to bother me because it actually started to dilute the overall experience of doing street photography for me. I know it sounds silly, but actually I started to feel guilty about one of my cameras sitting on the shelf collecting dust, and 9 out of 10 times it was my Fuji X100V. And also this indecision of, constant back and forth of which to use, it actually kept me from fully committing to film street photography. And that is something I wanted for a long time. I invested a lot of money in buying a new camera and the whole film experience, the ecosystem of it. As I mentioned in one of my other videos, my film camera, I don't bring it when I'm traveling because of the hassle of it. So I have to go through airport security and kind of the film I have to bring and how much. Where it's just easier and more convenient for me just to pick my digital camera, because I believe that film requires a different rhythm, it requires a different mindset. I have to slow down more, I have to be much more intentional, I have to trust the process, and most importantly, I have to trust my gut. And where digital, it's just easier, it's faster, it's familiar, and if you want to retake a frame because you can review it on your LCD screen, it's just much more easier. And what I realized is that it was keeping me from going through the hardest part. And especially when it comes to film street photography, I could just skip over the hardest part because I had a digital backup. I really believe that going through the hardest part is where we grow most as street photographers. So why did I sell the camera I came to love and that shaped the way I do street photography? The truth is that it served its purpose and I wasn't using it the same way that I did back in 2023. And also my style is evolving again, and I wanted to commit to film street photography without any distractions or without any digital backup. So selling is not about the money, it's actually about me moving forward as a street photographer and growing yet again. I've learned so much from shooting with the Fuji X100V for the past 2 years, but the biggest lesson I've learned has been that I have to embrace the limitation, especially when it came to this camera. So basically having one camera, one lens setup with a fixed focal length. And also sometimes you have to unlearn your old habits in order to see what matters most and grow as a street photographer. But for me personally, it reminded me to stay curious and don't be afraid of trying out new things. All right, I'll see you on the next one.